Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the key topics that sometimes goes under the radar in St. Anselm's Proslogion, because people are so interested in the so-called ontological argument or discussions of other divine attributes, is divine simplicity, or simplicitas, or being simplex in Latin. And Anselm is going to discuss this at greatest length in chapter 18, and then take it up again in chapter 23, where it's given a Trinitarian unfolding, you could say. But a little bit earlier on in the work, we're going to see both a mention of simplicity and a very interesting, let's call it rhetorical technique that we see Anselm using at multiple places within the Proslogion, and it is what we typically call a chiasm from the Greek word, the Greek letter, chi, right, the X, and like an X, you'll have two terms, and they are used in one way, and then they're transposed. So what we're actually going to see in chapter 14 is a mention of eternal happiness and happy eternity, right? And this is going to be in the course of, listing off some of the things that God is, some of the attributes, and this is in a chapter, how we both see and don't see God, right? So he says, I was seeking God. I found that he is the highest of all beings, than which nothing greater can be thought or nothing better can be thought. There's that important formula that shows up, and he is life itself, light, wisdom, goodness, eternal happiness, and happy eternity, and that he exists always and everywhere. Now, why is this rhetorical device important? Because it isn't just a rhetorical device. It's not mere ornamentation. It shows in a certain way that you can understand these attributes as interconnected with each other. So God is happiness and God is happy. God is eternal and God is eternity. And the happiness is eternal, and the eternity is happy, or blessed, if you like, beatus, right? And beatitudo. And so Anselm in this section is going to talk about something really quite important. The limitedness or narrowness or crampedness, you could even say, angustia of our own being and our minds, and God's vastness, amplitudo, right? God's limitlessness, you could even say, if you want. And so Anselm is going to say that our mind is pinched by its own narrowness and vanquished by your fullness. So he's going to say, how full is this truth? It is in everything that is true, how vast it is. In one glance, it sees all created things. And then he goes on and he concludes by saying, what purity, puritas, what simplicity, simplicitas, what certainty and splendor are there, more than any creature can understand. This is really good for setting the stage for thinking about simplicity. We tend to think that we know what simplicity means. Some things are complicated, some things are simple, right? If Anselm is right with what's going on in the Proslogion, we don't even really know what simplicity is. We have the word, we have ideas about it, but in its most real form, real thing, God, we don't actually understand that. So in a certain sense, we don't know what it is to be truly simple. Now, moving on to chapter 18, where now this question is going to be thematized. The title is, There Are No Parts in God or in His Eternity, which He Himself is. And we see again, Anselm is bemoaning, I don't fully understand these things. My soul hoped for satisfaction. It's overwhelmed by need. I fell down into darkness, but there is no darkness in God. The darkness is actually in me. And so he goes on and he says, well, what are you, God? He says, what will my heart understand you to be? Your life, your wisdom, your truth, your goodness, your happiness, your eternity, your every true good, right? This is not something new. He's recapitulating what he has said earlier in the Proslogion. These are what we call divine attributes, things that we can say truly about God. They are all, according to Anselm, things that it is better to be than not to be. They are all that than which nothing greater can be thought. Has to have by virtue of being that than which nothing greater can be thought. So God is a lot of different things, seemingly. Is God really a multiplicity? So here again, he talks about the human narrow understanding. We've got this angusta, cannot see so many things in one glance. Uno simul intuitu. Is intuitu translated perfectly by glance? Perhaps not. In one, intuitive grasp of the mind. We can't bring all these things together. When we're trying to think about what God is, we don't actually see the totality of God, even though we can enumerate these attributes and derive them rationally. And because it can't see so many things in one glance, it cannot delight in all of them at once either. And that's a really important point, because remember that the Proslogion is not just about proving things, it's about giving delight to Anselm's fellow monks and to whoever is going to be reading it, right? So this is, kind of an important issue here. So he goes on and he says, okay, are these things partes of God? That it's tempting to think of things that way. Like God is sort of a container, and you put goodness in, and justice in, and eternity in, and pick whatever else you want. Or there's the good part of God over here, and the eternal part of God over here, and you put them all together, and you get this wonderful, amazing thing, which is greater than anything that can be thought. Well, what is it to have parts? Anselm says that can't actually work, because each of these things that we predicate about God, goodness, for example, and justice, each of them is entirely, or all that, totem quod, God is. So God is totally justice. I was almost going to say every part of God, every aspect of God is justice, which means that God's justice is also God's eternity, is also God's life, is also God's wisdom. We could go on and on and on, and we could do this for every single one of the divine attributes. So because God is entirely what God is, as we saw in the Monologion, not just somebody who has justice. God is justice itself, justitia existens, that everything else that's going to be just participates in, or goodness in the Proslogion, right? So these things are not parts of God, and this is part of what it means to be simple.
And Anselm is going to make a contrast between us and everything else and God. Whatever is composed of parts, partibus, parts, right? Junctum, so put together, joined up from parts, is not completely one. Omnino unum. It's not a unity. It's got a unity to it, but it's not a complete unity, the way that God is. But in some sense, quodam modo, a plurality, plura, multiple things, many things, and not identical with itself. Now, that's the way that Williams is translating it, not identical with itself. If we wanted to be a little bit more literal, we would want to say whatever is composed of parts is different from itself. Diversum ad se ipsum. Different than its very own self. So there's a kind of lack of unity, even in things that seem to be completely simple and unified, if they're not God. And so, things like that can be broken up, dissolvi, divided into their constituent parts, either in fact, actu, in reality we could say, or in the human mind, the intellectum, right? This is the ablative of intellectum. So that means that we can at least conceptualize these things that are not a complete unity being divided into their parts, even if we can't divide them into their parts in reality. So, for example, you can take a human being and you can divide them up into their parts. When you do that, you don't really have a human being left. You got medical waste, right? Because you killed the human being. We're going to cut all your organs out and take your nervous system apart and take your circulatory system apart. Well, if you do that, you don't have the same thing. But you can do it in your mind, right? We actually used to have these encyclopedias that had transparencies where you could lift them up and, okay, we take the muscles. First we take the skin away, then we take the muscles away, then we take, we get all the way down to the skeleton in the end. Well, again, that's sort of a mental thing. That's not a real thing. You can't do any of that with God. Now, you could say, well, wait a second. Yes, I can. I can think of divine attributes as being separated from each other. Sure, you can think of that just like the fool can say in his heart, there is no God, because you can say those words, but if you really, really think it through and understand the reality of what you're talking about, you see that that doesn't work. So there is no parts in God. Anselm is going to say these having parts and these characteristics of having parts, these are foreign, aliena, to that than which nothing greater can be thought. Precisely because it is that than which nothing greater can be thought, it is going to be supremely simple, right? So he's going to go on and he's going to say that God is unity itself, ipsa unitas. So not the unities that we're used to thinking of. He's going to say, you are so much a unity, so much identical with yourself. You're in no respect dissimilar to yourself. You are, in fact, unity itself. You cannot be divided by any understanding. So what does this mean? Life, wisdom, all the rest, these are not parts of God. They are all one. Each of them is all of what you are, and each is what the rest are. This is a very important point having to do with the divine simplicity. Not only is each of them what God is, each is what the rest are. So every part, seemingly, every divine attribute, better said, is every other divine attribute. And you can say, whoa, wait a second. Justice isn't the same thing as goodness, isn't the same thing as eternity, isn't the same thing as life, isn't the same thing as wisdom. We can distinguish those in our mind. We have different words for those. Yes, for all these things, but not for God. Not if we're actually thinking things through as best as we human beings can about what God is. Anselm is going to draw some further conclusions about this in chapter 23. I mean, he also is going to talk a little bit about this in 22, but we're going to skip over that a bit because he's going to talk about the Trinity. So he says, this, good, this one supreme good, O God the Father, is your word, that is to say, your Son. So now we've already got two persons within the Godhead. There cannot be anything other than what you are, or anything greater or less than you, in the word which you utter yourself. For your word is as true as you are truthful. He is the same truth that you are, and no other. And he's going to go on and talk about the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is this, proceeds from you both. It's the love shared by you and your Son. Now, what's really key here? He says, you are so simple, simplex, that nothing can be born of you other than what you are. So, we can't say the Father is not exactly the same as the Son, and yet the Father is the same as the Son. This is a very difficult thing to wrap our heads around, that many Christian thinkers have tried to provide explanations for. Anselm is providing one here that has to do with divine simplicity. Same thing with the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son, right? They're all the same unity. And as a matter of fact, Anselm is going to go on and say something really interesting here. He says, nothing can proceed from the supreme simplicity that is other than that from which it proceeds. So whatever each of you is individually, that is what the whole Trinity is together, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then he's going to, once again, use this chiasm. But now it's a little bit more complicated, though not complex, if we're really thinking it through. Each of you individually is nothing other than the supremely simple unity and the supremely united simplicity, which cannot be multiplied or different from itself. So we get these two phrases, and let me just give you the Latin for these so you can kind of appreciate the wordplay here. Summa simplex unitas. Unitas is the noun in this case. Simplex is an adjective modifying it, and so is summa. Et summa una simplicitas. Right? The supreme one or united simplicity. So that is getting us deeper into this question. You notice that for Anselm, it's not just that God is this supremely united, whatever it happens to be, of all the divine attributes that God is, and just as much with each of these as he is with the others. It also has to do with the persons of the Trinity. And Anselm sees these as both reflections, both unfoldings of the supreme simplicity that God is.